My experience, in dealing with the homeschool population over the last 28 years is it's generally a very wholesome family situation that we're dealing with. They want the best for their kids and that type of thing, and they're striving in that direction, regardless of income level, whether it's whether the family only makes $25,000 a year or $100,000 a year. People love their kids and they want the best for them.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, my name is Jim Mason, Vice President at Homeschooled Legal Defense Association, and I'm happy to invite my guest, Steve Duvall, today, who is our director, HSLDA's Director of Research. He's a licensed school psychologist who has spent many years both teaching school psychology in graduate schools around the country, as well as been a homeschool researcher and has assisted us in a number of cases over the years. Welcome, Steve.
Nice to be here, Jim. Thank you.
So this morning, we wanted to talk to you about a study that recently came out, and it has a really snappy title that I'm sure will attract most of you. Probably already read it just based on the title. School Types in Adolescence and Subsequent Health and Well-Being in Young Adulthood, an Outcome-Wide Analysis.
That's it.
What in the world why are we talking about that study?
Well, Jim, it took some data from, starting over almost 25 years ago, close to it. And it included public schoolers, and you had private schools, religious schools, and homeschool students compared to the public school group. And they were trying to figure out over the long term what sort of effect these kinds of schooling, the different kinds of schoolings had on outcomes other than just academic outcomes. They were really looking at other things besides that, like civic engagement and psychological well-being and so forth.
Well, let's define some terms here. What is a longitudinal study? This was a longitudinal study. What is that?
It was. A longitudinal study is one that doesn't take place at one point in time. The data started being gathered in 1999, and it continued until 2010, basically. And it's a different kind of a developmental study. You study the same subjects, over and over and over again, throughout the course of that study. So instead of just taking a one snapshot at one point in time, you're getting snapshot after snapshot after snapshot over a long period of time. And this was about 11-year study. So
11-year study. How many students were involved, and how were they categorically broken out?
There were about 12,000 students. 9,500 of them were public school students. 1,300 happened to be from private schools, 1,100 from religious schools, and then 200 homeschoolers. So, and each of these smaller groups were compared to the public school group. So anyway, the homeschoolers were outnumbered by about 50 to 1, but at the same time, they had enough students, to run some analyses on and that type of thing. But the students, Jim, it was really, it was interesting. Every one of them, every one of these 12,000 students happened to be children of nurses.
Now, that's a question I didn't see in your paper, and I've been curious about. Why did they use that as the segregator for students?
Well, it happened to, these authors who published this most recent manuscript, they didn't collect this data. They were using data from two older studies, and one was called, the Nurses Health Study 2, and then the Growing Up Today study. And they just took older data that were available to them, and they basically reanalyzed it. But this time they were looking at for some different things. So it's just basically older information that they've tried to kind of analyze in a different way and present in a different way.
So somebody was interested in how children of nurses do at some point, collected a bunch of data that these guys repurposed. Does that present any problems as far as like generalizing it out to the population?
Well, it does in the sense that if you keep in mind that, first of all, you've got 12,000 kids here, and most of them were from affluent, non-Hispanic white families. Everyone were the children of nurses. And so, when you take your findings and you try to then generalize those, it really limits those to who they really apply to. So not very many of us are children of nurses, but at the same time, there's quite a few white affluent individuals, and that type of thing, that homeschool across the country, and that. But there's a whole lot more people in this country than are other than white affluent individuals, and so it does present problems when you try to generalize the findings to other groups outside of this one.
So what kind of things were they comparing these groups of students to? What were the things they were comparing? Well,
they administered this Growing Up Today survey on a continual basis to each one. And those were to really to determine how kids were developing psychologically over the years. They used this one survey continually, but they used another one right in the middle of the study that really kind of threw a monkey in the works, as you will.
Well, let's come back to that.
Okay.
I know where you're heading with that, and we're not going to avoid it, but I want to come back to it because I'd like to kind of lay out the bigger findings first,
okay,
and then come back to the smaller survey instrument they used in the middle. What were the traits that they were looking for, and the behaviors and so forth? What kind of things were they looking for generally, and how did that turn out for homeschool families?
Okay. Well, Jim, they really did kind of two levels of analysis. During the first one, again, they're comparing these different groups to the public school group. And at the end of this first analysis, what they did is they found out, for homeschoolers, they were more likely to attend religious activities, more likely to forgive, more likely to be civically involved, or volunteer, that is, more likely to have fewer sexual partners, have a sense of mission in life, and then also one of their findings was that they were more likely to experience PTSD, or post-traumatic stress syndrome, in young adulthood. And two other findings were that they were less likely to use marijuana and also less likely to attain a college degree by the time they reached their mid-20s.
So you reviewed this report sort of as interesting, interested in the outcomes, the things they reported, but also you reviewed it for its kind of the validity of their outcomes. So on these issues, apart from the PTSD issue, the religious services and those kinds of things, the greater sense of mission in life and the like, what did you conclude about their analysis about this cohort of homeschooled students?
Well, one thing more I need to mention about the analysis, Jim, all of those things that I just mentioned a moment ago kind of came out of the first level of analysis. By the time they did their second one, the number of those variables had narrowed. And so the only things that came up surviving the two levels of analysis were the fact that homeschoolers were more likely to attend religious services, volunteer, they were more likely to forgive, and they were less likely to attain a college degree by the time they were in their mid-20s. So those were the ones that survived both levels of analysis.
So let's talk about the four, what would you call them? The outcomes that they determined in the second set of analysis were the most valid.
Okay.
what were those again?
The ones that survived both levels of analysis were the fact that homeschool students had a tendency in early adulthood then to attend or be more likely to attend religious services, volunteer in their communities, be more forgiving, and then also, but they were less likely to attain a college degree by the time they were in their mid-20s.
So those attending religious services as adults, I've read other studies that have confirmed that, this confirms some of the things that I've read. What does that tell you about homeschooling families that, based on your experience of all these years working with homeschool families and studying homeschooling?
Jim, I would say it's a good indicator that the homeschool families do a nice job of developing their kids, to be good and active, moral citizens. And I think all of that speaks well, for the contributions they'll later be able to make to our society. So, no, I think it speaks real well for them.
So you've done a lot of research on kind of academic engagement in different educational settings, specifically in the homeschool setting. And that depends on a lot of one-on-one attention and so forth. Does that translate out into these other areas, do you think?
Well, Jim, I think what translates out probably is the idea that they're being provided with a good and wholesome environment to begin with, and that the parents do a nice job of coaching their kids, preparing them for adulthood.
And one of the things you point out is that because this study was based on the original survey of children of nurses that were mostly non-Hispanic, white, affluent people, what do you think this study has to say about the homeschooling population today, or does it leave questions unanswered?
Well, Jim, I think it leaves a number of questions unanswered. Like when we hear this finding, the one that did survive both levels of analysis, the one about there's fewer homeschool kids who or homeschool young adults who eventually who are not finished with a college degree by the time they're in their mid-20s. When you look at what was happening, this data was gathered between 11 and 23 years ago, and I think a lot of it was gathered at a time when institutions of higher learning were putting more obstacles in the way of homeschool kids who wanted to go to college. They also had more difficulty getting financial aid and that type of thing. So when you consider that angle, it doesn't surprise me that data that was collected this long ago reflected that fewer homeschool kids were graduating from college because the institutions themselves were making it harder for those kids to get in. And another thing that I think is important to mention at this time with regards to that particular finding is for quite some time, information collected by the National Center for Education Statistics, has told us that one of the major reasons why parents homeschool their kids in the first place is because they have disabilities and they're not comfortable or they're not satisfied with the services that their kids receive at the local schools. So they pull those kids out of school, homeschool themselves. Well, if you've got a good proportion of homeschool kids who have disabilities, it makes sense that fewer of them would have graduated, because those are the kinds of kids that they may get through college. It's going to be more difficult for them, so their progress may be slower, or they may not be able to go at all.
And a lot of that landscape has changed, not about the disabilities, but college admissions and college financial aid. And I think you point out that lots and lots of colleges, top colleges, Ivy League colleges, are actively recruiting homeschoolers today, and the barriers to entry into higher education have largely been removed. They're certainly a lot lower today than they were when the survey was being done.
And Jim, because of that right there, I think we would come up with different results. I mean, I believe they would if we collected data about that very issue and then analyzed the current data. But right now, this is quite old right now.
Well, another thing that I don't know that, I don't know how you study this or if it's been studied, but homeschooling, in my experience, not based on any research that I've done or anything, but just in my own experience and even in my own family. Homeschooled kids have a pretty strong entrepreneurial spirit. Oftentimes, a lot of kids that I know don't go to college because they kind of see college as a waste of time, and they just get on with life and start their own businesses and become creative and do things.
Jim, interesting. I mean, I haven't seen any studies to that effect either, but I have anecdotally, picked that up from a lot of homeschool families. Their kids, when they get to that age, they've gone out and they've already begun small businesses of their own and that type of thing. And that would, if they might decide later that they would need the training to take that business effort further, but right out of high school perhaps, or about the time other kids are about ready to get into college, they may be longer, or it may be longer before they actually begin their college career, their college studies.
So one of the items in this study that you've been itching to get to,
I have.
And I'd like you to just set this up. They used, I guess in this earlier nurses study, they used for part of this survey period of time, an instrument that was designed to screen for PTSD. What is PTSD?
Well, post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's a disorder that individuals suffer from after going through trauma. And not everyone experiences it who goes through a traumatic event, but many do. And that's, and basically it becomes a clinical issue when it begins to really prevent people from functioning well in life.
So in your paper, you talk about they use this instrument, this screening instrument, for a part of this time. How many years in the middle of this study did they actually use that?
Well, it appears they only used it once. So they used the other tool, on an annual basis. This one was used on one occasion during this longitudinal study.
So from 1999 to 2010, they used the server that came up with the most interesting and valid results every year.
Yes.
For the PTSD portion, they used a screening tool once.
That is my understanding when I look at this manuscript.
Okay, so what did they conclude?
Well, before we, they conclude on the basis of this that homeschoolers, now again, this is something that only passed the first level of analysis, not the second. But they concluded that kids who had been homeschooled were more likely to experience PTSD as a young adult. Okay,
so break that down, because it is important to understand the limitations of that finding.
It is. Well, and I tell you what, in the field of psychology or psychiatry, that type of thing, when you're trying to diagnose somebody, you really need to use the best tools that are available to you, an assessment device, but you need to take a multi-tiered approach to diagnosing, and it includes observations, it includes interviews, it includes a careful record review. But the tests that you use are supposed to be high-quality tests before you can slap a label like that on someone. And they used a screener, a screening test, this Breslau's 7-item short screening scale for PTSD. And a screening inventory, all it's really good for is to really signal the need for further testing. But the implication that, and it makes sense that researchers use a screening tool because they've got 12,000 subjects that they need to test, and they couldn't do a full assessment on all 12,000 of them. It'd be way too expensive. So they take a shortcut by using a screener, but by using a screener, they imply that these students had PTSD, or more of them had it, based on the results of a screener. And but unless you're really paying very, very close attention as you read the manuscript, it's easy to get away from you. You don't know that that's what has gone on. So it's really a misuse of a screening device, if you're going to imply somebody has PTSD. And another thing I want to say about this particular screener is, remember, we're talking about data that was gathered quite some time ago. And they took this instrument that basically became obsolete some time ago. Like in 2013, Ptsd criteria in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a manual that psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose people.
That's kind of commonly known. People may have heard of it, the DSM.
DSM.
And what number are we up
We
to?
are on DSM-5.
And so they revise this DSM periodically as our understanding of things change.
That is correct. And matter of fact, the one that they were basing it on was the DSM-4. Well, this little, again, the title of it is the 7-item short screening scale. Well, 3 of the items on that 7-item test aren't used any longer. They're completely obsolete. And when they were going through and using this for the study, you had to get 6 out of 7 of them. The individual had to check 6 out of 7 before they'd say, okay, you have PTSD, or you likely have it. And, it's kind of like, well.
So you said something interesting that I think is, and I think you'll agree with this from reading your paper. The screening test, if you check 6 of the boxes, it's not necessarily likely that you have PTSD, but it's a clinician would say we need to do further diagnostic testing to confirm or to figure this out.
That's exactly right.
It doesn't really mean you have it or are likely to have it. It's
That's
just a screening tool to say we should look more closely at this.
Yes, and not only are you only supposed to conclude that you should do further evaluation, but now that the criteria is completely changed, they found out that some of those were not good items anymore. So they weren't accurate items. They weren't valid items. So they've dropped them altogether.
So the reason you've been itching to get at this is that sort of the findings that show that homeschooled kids develop into productive individuals who have attend religious services and the other 3 things that they concluded can kind of get lost in this. Also likely to have PTSD, but the 4 positive findings survived 2 levels of analysis based on 12 years of this longitudinal study being done in the same way, and the kind of the glaring red light PTSD finding was based on a screening tool that didn't survive the second level of analysis and is now obsolete.
That's exactly right.
So
you have summarized that better than I would.
Well, that's
exactly right.
When I first read the study and then read your review of it, that's really important. I mean, it's almost, should the PTSD survey or the screening tool results in their study, how much emphasis did they give it? Were they fair about all of these, caveats that we've talked about?
Well, they don't tell you that they used the results of a screening tool that's now obsolete. So you're not informed of that. And there's not very many of the findings that only survived the first level of analysis. And not the second,
yeah.
But this one is still even mentioned in the abstract. It's the very first thing that you read.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like it was, given undue attention, as you will. It wasn't one of their final results that they found was significant, but they brought it up anyway. So, that was alarming to me.
Yeah. So it's alarming from a research standpoint, and it's also alarming because it was included as if it was sort of on an equal footing with the actual findings that survived the second level of analysis.
It's kind of like reading a newspaper heading that says something to get your interest, and you get in and you read it, and it's not like that at all.
It's not what it appeared to be.
Not what I expected. That's right.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. So let's just go. Let's circle back and. Can you tell me just what's the utility, usefulness, does it add to our understanding of homeschooling, especially just leaving aside the kind of suspect PTSD finding,
okay,
the other 4 findings that survived both levels of analysis in this 12-year longitudinal study, confined to children of nurses from affluent non-white Hispanic homes.
Mm-hmm.
Does it nevertheless add any useful information to our understanding of how homeschool kids thrive when they grow up? And does it suggest any further studies?
Well, Jim, I feel like it has some positives in it for homeschoolers, because it does give us it does present the notion, that, hey, homeschool parents do a nice job of coaching their kids to be wholesome, productive participants in our society. And those kinds of participants are needed, especially in this day and age. And so I think it says some real positive things about that.
And we can rely on those as that's interesting and valid information.
And it survived both of their analyses. And one of the things, but you're using older data, so you always gotta kind of put it through your mind. Yes, this is a general finding, and this is the way this reflected what was going on 10, 12 years ago. That type of thing. But at the same time, it does reflect that the need for more information about this, because, first of all, because it's dated, and so it would be nice to do a more thorough study to really find out what the college admission rates are now for homeschool kids. Have most of those barriers been removed by most universities, or all, or some universities, that type of thing, or do some still kind of hinder homeschoolers? It'd be good to study something like that, or would suggest that it needs to be done. I don't think we need to get into the PTSD business at all, because I think this is a very just kind of an invalid tool that came up with some poor findings. And I don't think we need to pay that any mind at all as far as future research is concerned. Because, my experience, in dealing with the homeschool population over the last probably 28 years is, it's generally a very wholesome, family situation that we're dealing with. They want the best for their kids and that type of thing, and they're striving in that direction, regardless of income level, whether it's, whether the family only makes $25,000 a year or $100,000 a year. People love their kids and they want the best for them, and that's what I've generally found. And I think that's reflected in this study. Because you're finding there's only 200 children again that were participants in this study, but when you consider that, they had some really good findings, especially for a group that small. Stood out like a sore thumb.
Well, thank you for digging into this and writing the paper. And the paper can be found on our website at hslda.org. And it was written by our Director of Research, Dr. Stephen Duvall, who is working on some other projects for us as well. Anything in the offing for you coming up?
Well, I'm trying to get something in the offing. We'll say it is a developmental study. We'll look at here's the plan anyway, to look at the growth of academic skill over the years, based on how long someone has been homeschooled. And,
well, it sounds really good, and we're really looking forward to seeing how that comes into fruition. Any final thoughts about this study?
Jim, I don't want to give you the impression. There were some things in there, obviously, that I took an issue with, but at the same time, by and large, it was a good approach to try to reanalyze and take a different look at these different kinds of schools and the impact that they had on development. But anyway, I think in the long run, replication is always a big part of science. It's hard to replicate a study that is a longitudinal study because they're long and expensive, to pull off, but hopefully we'll have others that can be accomplished here in the future so that we can have something to compare them to.
Well, very good. Thanks again to my guest, Dr. Stephen Duvall, HSLDA's Director of Research. And for Homeschooled Talks, I'm Jim Mason. You can find us at hslda.org.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law. And we'll represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To learn more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you enjoyed this conversation, leave a review to let us know what you think. To hear more conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to this podcast or head on over to hslda.org/podcast for more inspiring stories and awesome ideas about homeschooling. That's all for today. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll see you next time.